The morning room of Thornfield Manor possessed that peculiar chill common to spaces that are rarely occupied. The sort of atmospheric quality that suggests the furniture itself has grown resentful of neglect. Lord Peter stood before the escritoire with Bunter at his elbow. His valet had materialized with characteristic timing, materializing from whatever dimension Bunter's inhabited when not required for immediate employment, and regarded the small mahogany drawer with an expression of profound concentration. Inspector Marsham hung about 3 paces distant, his constable hovering nearby like a nervous satellite, whilst Mrs. Pemberton stood sentinel by the doorway, her arms crossed in a posture suggesting she was prepared to defend the honour of Thornfield's housekeeping against any insinuation of impropriety. The drawer itself was unremarkable, a simple brass handle, a veneer of dark wood showing the subtle crazing of age, and a lock that had long since surrendered to time and indifference. Lord Peter, having produced a delicate pick-lock-pick from his waistcoat pocket with the casual air of a man retrieving a handkerchief, applied himself to the mechanism with the concentration of a musicologist tuning a violin. The lock, it transpired, was cosmetic rather than functional. It yielded to his ministrations after perhaps 30 seconds, and the drawer slid open with a whisper that seemed to echo through the morning room with the significance of a confession. Inside lay precisely what Mrs. Pemberton had described, a small collection of theatrical playbills, their covers faded to the colour of old cream, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon of what had once been pale blue, several dance cards from various balls and assemblies, and, most intriguingly, a small daguerreotype in a leather frame, its image so faded as to be nearly illegible. Lord Peter lifted the photograph with care, holding it to the light that filtered weakly through the morning room windows, and studied it with an intensity that caused Inspector Marsham to shift his weight from one foot to the other in the manner of a man attending a lecture he does not entirely comprehend. "Curious," Lord Peter murmured, more to himself than to his audience. "Most curious indeed." He turned to Mrs. Pemberton with the air of a man who has just observed something of genuine interest. "This drawer, when precisely was it last opened, to your knowledge?" Mrs. Pemberton frowned, her brow furrowing in the manner of one attempting to recall details of monumental unimportance. "I should think not since Miss Eleanor's marriage, sir. 3 years ago now, as I said. There was no occasion for anyone to disturb it." Lord Peter nodded slowly, replacing the daguerreotype with meticulous care. "And the key to this drawer, where was it kept?" "There was no key, sir. At least, not that I ever knew of. The lock was never in working order so far as I can recall. Young Miss Eleanor never bothered with it." At this, Inspector Marsham stepped forward with a renewed sense of purpose, apparently sensing that some material fact was being elucidated. "What of Mr. Timothy Ashford, Lord Peter? Did he ever show interest in this room?" Lord Peter extracted the bundle of letters from the drawer and held them up to the light, examining the envelopes rather than opening them, a gesture that spoke volumes about the delicacy of his scruples regarding private correspondence. "That is precisely the question, Inspector, is it not? One wonders whether Timothy even knew of this drawer's existence. One wonders, furthermore, why anyone should wish to hide, or indeed, why anyone should take the trouble to break open a lock that was, by Mrs. Pemberton's account, already defunct." He turned to face the assembled group, and in that moment, despite the prosaic setting and the mundane collection of sentimental trifles, something shifted in the atmosphere of the morning room. "The lock," Lord Peter continued, "was broken recently. Observe the scratches around the mechanism, fresh wood shavings barely discoloured. Someone within the last few days, I would venture, attempted to force this drawer open. The attempt was clumsy, suggesting either haste or unfamiliarity with such work. And yet," he paused for effect, "they apparently found nothing worth removing, for the drawer remains here, and its contents largely undisturbed." Bunter, at this moment, produced a small lens from his jacket pocket and held it toward the escritoire's surface, his movements suggesting he had anticipated this development hours ago, or perhaps had simply never truly accepted that such an accessory should remain unused. Lord Peter accepted the lens with the gratitude one reserves for old friends and colleagues. Through the magnification, he examined the interior of the drawer with methodical precision, finally producing from amongst the theatrical programs a small slip of paper, yellowed and creased, upon which several words had been written in a feminine hand that wavered between Gothic affectation and genuine distress. "My dear," he read aloud, pausing to allow the full significance to settle upon his audience like a particularly heavy fog. "If you are reading this, then the game is finished. I have taken what was mine, and I pray you will never understand why. Forgive me if you can." Inspector Marsham's face had assumed the color of a man who has been struck repeatedly with contradictory information and is no longer certain which direction constitutes up. But who? What does this mean, precisely? Lord Peter folded the note with exquisite care and placed it gently upon the escritoire's base. "It means, my dear Inspector, that we have been conducting our inquiry with our gazes firmly fixed upon the wrong individual entirely. It means that whatever took place in that locked library, it was not Reginald Ashford who orchestrated Timothy's demise. And it means, most significantly, that we must speak immediately with Miss Eleanor, because I suspect that your murder victim was not quite the harmless wastrel everyone has assumed him to be. The telephone exchange at Thornfield Village was operated by a Miss Halloway, a woman of indeterminate age whose tenure in that position had granted her a comprehensive knowledge of every private conversation conducted within a 5-mile radius, though professional discretion, or perhaps merely strategic self-preservation, prevented her from sharing such intelligence with anyone, save those she deemed sufficiently important. Lord Peter, however, possessed an ineffable quality that caused even the most guarded of matrons to unfold their secrets with the inevitability of a flower responding to sunlight. Within the quarter hour, he had secured an address in Manchester, a rather less than flattering assessment of Miss Eleanor's marriage prospects, and the intelligence that a telegram had been sent from Thornfield to that address on the very morning of Timothy's death. Inspector Marsham, upon learning this particular detail, had begun to exhibit signs of genuine distress, scratching his ear with such violence that one feared for the structural integrity of the cartilage. It was precisely at this juncture that Reginald Ashford, who had been pacing the study like a caged animal whilst awaiting developments, made what would later prove to be a rather costly mistake. He had apparently reached some internal threshold of anxiety and had attempted to bolt from the house, a gesture so theatrical in its execution that it scarcely required Inspector Marsham's constables to apprehend him. Reginald had made it as far as the rose garden before being gently but firmly persuaded to reconsider his trajectory, and it was during this undignified retrieval that Lord Peter observed something of interest. The old man's hands were trembling not with fear, but with what appeared to be genuine relief. This subtle distinction would prove crucial in the hours to come. By the time Reginald had been installed in the drawing-room beneath the watchful eye of a constable, with instructions to ensure he remained present, Lord Peter had dispatched Bunter to Manchester via the afternoon train with instructions regarding Miss Eleanor Hargreaves, for she had taken her husband's name upon marriage, and a request that her movements during the previous week be carefully ascertained. The valet, whose network of connections rivaled that of the Secret Service in both scope and reliability, had accepted these instructions with nothing more than a slight inclination of the head, suggesting that he had perhaps anticipated some such errand and had already packed a bag in preparation. It was whilst awaiting the inevitable telephone call from Manchester that Lord Peter undertook a rather more detailed examination of Timothy's personal effects, which had been secured by the police and were now arrayed upon the library desk, the very desk, one noted with a certain morbid precision, upon which the young man's corpse had sprawled only hours before. The contents proved illuminating: a railway timetable from London to the Midlands, annotated with several dates and times, a telegram never sent, addressed to an individual named C. Marsh, and requesting a private interview regarding the inheritance matter, and most intriguingly, a letter in a masculine hand, unsigned but dated some 3 months prior, which read, in part, "You ought not have come. You understand the danger you place us both in. If he discovers what you know, we are both finished. I beg of you, return to London and forget that you ever learned the truth. For Eleanor's sake, if not for mine, I implore you to silence. Lord Peter read this missive 3 times, his expression growing progressively more grave, and then handed it to Inspector Marsham with a gesture that suggested he was presenting the final piece of a particularly intricate puzzle. "I rather think," Lord Peter said softly, "that we have been laboring under a fundamental misapprehension regarding the nature of this crime. Timothy Ashford did not come to Thornfield as a simple wastrel intent upon squandering his inheritance. He came as someone who had discovered something, or rather, someone, and was not above utilizing that discovery as a mechanism for coercion. The telephone rang at precisely 4:30, and it was indeed Bunter, calling from Manchester with a report that was both succinct and devastating in its implications. Miss Eleanor had been seen leaving her residence early on the morning of the 23rd, traveling by cab to the railway station. She had not returned until late that evening, and when she had, her maid reported, she had been in a state of considerable distress, her dress torn and her face bearing the marks of what appeared to be a hard journey undertaken in haste. More significantly still, she had destroyed several letters that evening, burning them in the fireplace whilst her husband remained at his office, a fact that the observant Mrs. Hargreaves's maid had felt compelled to mention to Bunter with the enthusiasm of one finally permitted to share a fascinating secret. When Lord Peter conveyed this intelligence to Inspector Marsham, that worthy officer had begun to display all the symptoms of a man whose previously stable understanding of events had been subjected to a thorough demolition. But if Miss Eleanor was here, if she travelled to Thornfield, then surely she is the one responsible. Marsham had begun, only to be silenced by Lord Peter's raised hand. "Not responsible for the murder, I think," Lord Peter said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the window where the October afternoon was surrendering itself to dusk. "But rather, I suspect, responsible for a great many other things. The question now becomes not who poisoned Timothy Ashford, but rather why someone felt compelled to poison him at all, and more significantly, what truth he had discovered that made his continued existence an impediment to someone's carefully constructed facade." He turned to face Inspector Marsham directly, and in his expression there was none of the usual irony or detachment. "I rather think we must speak with Miss Eleanor immediately, and I suspect that when we do, we shall discover that the villain of this piece is not the obvious one, but rather someone whose crime predates Timothy's death by a considerable margin indeed." The journey to Manchester was undertaken with a deliberation that suggested Lord Peter was in no particular hurry, despite the apparent urgency of the matter at hand. Inspector Marsham, accustomed to the rapid progression of police investigation, found himself somewhat bewildered by Lord Peter's insistence upon stopping for an adequate luncheon and his subsequent detour to examine the architectural peculiarities of a particularly unremarkable railway bridge. It was only when they had settled into the compartment of the London-bound express that Lord Peter deigned to explain his seemingly meandering approach. "The virtue of haste, Inspector, is vastly overrated in matters of criminal investigation. Criminals, you see, are rather like nervous horses. They tend to bolt when one approaches too rapidly. Far better to allow them to exhaust themselves with worry whilst one observes the landscape at leisure." Marsham, who had been raised in a tradition of police work that valued prompt action and thorough documentation, had scratched his ear in a gesture that was becoming almost reflexive and settled himself for what promised to be an educational, if somewhat exasperating, afternoon. The Hargreaves' residence proved to be a substantial Victorian villa of the sort that announces respectability with the force of a trumpet fanfare, all red brick and bay windows, and the sort of careful landscaping that speaks of a householder determined to prove his place in the world. Eleanor Hargreaves herself received them in a drawing-room decorated with the assiduous taste of a woman who has consulted magazines rather than consulted her own inclinations, and who had decided that comfort was less important than the appearance of comfort. She was perhaps 28, with dark hair and the sort of fine-featured prettiness that suggests a certain delicacy of constitution rather than any genuine beauty. More significant, however, was the quality of tension that emanated from her like heat from a furnace, a tension so palpable that one could almost hear it humming beneath her carefully modulated speech. Lord Peter, upon being introduced, had examined her with the focused intensity of a lepidopterist examining a particularly rare specimen. a scrutiny that had caused the young woman's composure to waver perceptibly. "Miss Eleanor," he began, with a courtesy that somehow suggested he was asking questions to which he already possessed comprehensive answers, "I wonder if you might elucidate for us the precise nature of your visit to Thornfield on the 23rd of this month. The servants seem to recall your absence, though your father was apparently unaware that you had even left Manchester." Eleanor's face undergone a remarkable transformation, the careful mask of social propriety slipping away to reveal something raw and more authentic beneath. She had opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her fingers worrying at a thread on her sleeve with the intensity of one attempting to unravel secrets. It was her husband, a tall man of perhaps 30, with the preoccupied expression of one whose legal practice has taught him to doubt the veracity of nearly everything, who had interjected. "My wife has nothing to say to you without proper legal representation. I must insist." Lord Peter had raised a hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both deferential and commanding. "I am not, I assure you, accusing your wife of murder. Rather, I am attempting to establish certain facts regarding the movements of various individuals on the day in question. Facts which, I suspect, are far more damaging to your wife's peace of mind if left unexplained than if they are calmly enumerated for the purposes of criminal investigation." It was at this precise moment that Eleanor had begun to weep, not with the dramatic intensity of theatrical grief, but with the quiet, exhausted tears of someone whose secret has finally become too heavy to bear. Her husband, whatever his legal reservations, had moved to her side with the automaticity of long habit, and Lord Peter, observing this gesture with what one could only describe as profound sympathy, had seated himself with the air of a man prepared to listen for however long might be necessary. "He came to see me," Eleanor had begun, her voice barely above a whisper. "Timothy came to Manchester. He said he knew. He said he had discovered something about father and about what happened with mother's jewels, the ones that disappeared 15 years ago. He said he had proofs, letters, that mother had been sending them to someone, and that she had taken her own life because of it." The confession had hung in the drawing-room like a thundercloud, and Inspector Marsham had begun to exhibit signs of acute confusion. "But Miss Eleanor," he had protested, "your mother died of a heart condition. Everyone knows. Everyone knows what my father chose to tell them," Eleanor had said with sudden vehemence. But Timothy had found letters from mother to someone named Charles, letters that suggested— She had broken off, unable to continue, and it was Lord Peter who had finished her thought with terrible gentleness. "Letters that suggested your father had orchestrated an affair between your mother and the household steward, and that when your mother discovered his infidelity and attempted to leave, he had locked her in the East Wing until despair accomplished what he could not." Eleanor's silence had been confirmation enough. Timothy threatened to expose it all, she had continued. He said he would go to the police, that he would ensure father was prosecuted for whatever one calls it when a man drives his wife to take her own life through cruelty and isolation. He said unless father paid him a substantial sum, he would make everything public. It was at this juncture that Lord Peter had leaned forward, his expression grave. "And what did you do, Miss Eleanor?" "I told him I would speak to father. I told him that I would convince father to pay, but I lied. I rode back to Thornfield that evening and I confronted my father about the letters, and he admitted everything, all of it." The silence that followed Eleanor's revelation was of that particular quality that suggests the very air of the drawing-room has crystallized into something solid and oppressive. Inspector Marsham had begun to scratch his ear with such ferocity that one genuinely feared for the structural integrity of the organ in K. Styon, whilst her husband had moved to the sideboard with the gait of a man seeking liquid fortification against the mounting complexities of his domestic situation. Lord Peter, however, had remained perfectly still, his expression one of profound concentration, as though he were mentally reconstructing events with the precision of an architect examining the blueprints of a building he suspected contained hidden chambers. "When precisely did you return to Thornfield?" he had asked, his voice carrying that particular quality of gentle inexorability that suggested evasion would be not merely futile, but fundamentally exhausting. "Late in the evening," Eleanor had replied, her fingers still worrying at that thread upon her sleeve. Perhaps 8 o'clock. I told my maid I had gone to visit a friend in the village. Father was in his study. I knocked, and when he admitted me, I showed him the telegram Timothy had sent earlier that day, threatening to come to Thornfield the following week with the letters and the proofs. Lord Peter's eyes had narrowed fractionally, a gesture so minute that one would have missed it had one not been watching with the attention of a man who understands that significance often resides in the smallest movements. And your father's reaction? He was terrified, Eleanor had said, and there had been something almost pitiful in her tone. Not of exposure, I think, but of confronting what he had done, of acknowledging that Mother's death had been his fault. He kept saying that Timothy was a blackmailer, a parasite, that he deserved to be stopped. And then he said something that I shall never forget. He said, if only he would simply go away, if only there was some way to ensure his silence permanently. Eleanor had paused at this juncture, and the implication hanging in the air had been sufficiently clear that Inspector Marsham had begun fumble, ing for his notebook with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for flotsam. You did not, Lord Peter had said softly, take that as a literal instruction? No, Eleanor had replied with sudden vehemence. No, I did not. I left him there and returned to Manchester that same night. I took the late train, and I have not seen my father since. When I learned that Timothy was dead, I was horrified, but I also knew that my father would be suspected, and I could not bear to see him imprisoned for something that might have been prevented if I had simply paid Timothy's demands. Lord Peter had risen from his chair at this point, and had moved toward the window, gazing out upon the Manchester street with an expression of such profound melancholy that one might have supposed him contemplating the fundamental tragedies inherent in the human condition. When he had spoken, his voice had carried none of its usual arch detachment. Miss Eleanor, I must ask you a question of considerable delicacy. Between the moment you left your father's study and the moment Timothy died, did anyone else visit Thornfield Manor? Did you, for instance, observe your father departing the house, or did you notice anything unusual upon your departure? Eleanor had shaken her head slowly. The servants had retired. I used the side entrance. I saw no one, and I observed nothing unusual. The house was quiet. Lord Peter had turned from the window, and in his expression there had been a quality of terrible certainty. Inspector Marsham, I wonder if you might inquire of the local constabulary regarding one particular detail. I wish to know, with absolute precision, at what time the locked library door was discovered to be locked. Was it locked when Miss Cottage discovered Timothy's body, or was the door locked subsequently? Marsham had blinked at this seemingly tangential question. It was locked when she discovered him. That's the first thing she reported, that she couldn't open the door, and she had to find the master key to gain entry. Lord Peter's face had assumed an expression of such profound sadness that one might have supposed him mourning a personal loss. And the key was found upon the carpet inside the locked room. Yes, precisely as you observed it yourself, Marsham had confirmed. 3 feet from the body, you said. Lord Peter had nodded slowly, and then had asked the question that would reorient the entire investigation. Tell me, Miss Eleanor, when you arrived at Thornfield that evening, did you observe the library lights illuminated? Was Timothy in the library when you arrived, or did he arrive after you had already departed? Eleanor's face had gone absolutely ashen. I didn't see Timothy at all. I assumed he was still at the inn in the village. I never knew he was in the house. Precisely, Lord Peter had said, and his voice had carried the terrible finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Which means that Timothy Ashford died in that locked library sometime between the hours of 6 and 8 o'clock in the evening. And your father, Miss Eleanor, was not present at Thornfield when that death occurred. Which raises the rather urgent question of who was present in that house besides your father, and why that individual felt compelled to ensure Timothy's permanent and complete silence. I rather think we must return to Thornfield immediately and have a word with the domestic staff regarding their movements that evening. Because unless I am very much mistaken, the killer is not your father at all, but rather someone far closer to the household. Someone whose crime predates Timothy's arrival by considerably more than 3 years. The return journey to Thornfield was accomplished in a silence that seemed to deepen with every passing mile, as though the railway carriage itself had absorbed the weight of revelation, and was now reluctant to permit even the smallest utterance to disturb the gathering darkness. Inspector Marsham had attempted at one juncture to articulate a theory regarding the culpability of various household staff members, but had been silenced by a look from Lord Peter so profoundly discouraging that he had abandoned the attempt, and had instead devoted himself to studying the rain-streaked windows with the concentration of a man examining the most fascinating landscape ever to present itself to human observation. Lord Peter, meanwhile, had occupied himself with the examination of the unsigned letter recovered from Timothy's possessions, reading it repeatedly with the focused intensity of one attempting to extract meaning from every inflection, every carefully chosen word. It was only as they drew within sight of Thornfield's gates that he had finally spoken, and his words had carried the quality of a man thinking aloud rather than addressing his companion. The writer of this letter knew Timothy intimately, he had observed. Note the phrasing, "for Eleanor's sake if not for mine." This suggests a relationship of considerable personal investment, not merely familial concern, and the reference to the inheritance matter. It suggests that the writer had knowledge of Timothy's intentions regarding Thornfield, knowledge that would ordinarily be confined to a very small circle indeed. The constable stationed at Thornfield's gates had admitted them with the somewhat bewildered expression of one who has been left to guard a house full of potential murderers without being provided adequate instruction in the management of such a responsibility. Reginald Ashford, it was reported, remained in custody pending further investigation, though his solicitor had been making increasingly pointed inquiries regarding the basis upon which his client continued to be detained. It was in the library itself, however, that Lord Peter began his renewed examination, moving about the room with the unhurried precision of a man who understands that observation requires time and concentration in equal measure. The desk where Timothy had been found was now bare, the body having been removed for post-mortem examination, but Lord Peter examined the surface with the care of an archaeologist brushing dust from ancient artifacts. He requested that the constable bring him the catalogues of the library's contents, a request that seemed so absurdly tangential that Marsham began to wonder if the strain of the investigation had perhaps begun to tell upon the younger man's faculties. But when the leather-bound volumes arrived, Lord Peter pored over them with undivided attention, cross-referencing entries with a concentration that suggested he was searching for something of profound significance. It was Bunter who, having returned from Manchester the previous evening, appeared in the doorway with the inevitability of a man who had perhaps never truly departed, and who now presented a small leather journal to his employer with the air of one who has anticipated such a request. Lord Peter accepted the journal, which proved to be a household accounts ledger spanning the previous 5 years, and began to examine it with renewed intensity. "Inspector," he said finally, without looking up from the pages, "I must ask you a rather specific question regarding the household staff. Has anyone been employed here for more than 4 years? Anyone whose tenure predates the current period?" Marsham consulted his notes with some bewilderment. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, has been here for 6 years. The head butler, Mr. Cheverley, no, that's the solicitor. The butler is named Pritchard, and he has been here for..." He paused, consulting his notes more carefully. "Some 7 years, if the records are accurate. And prior to becoming butler, what was Mr. Pritchard's position?" Lord Peter inquired, and in his voice there was that particular quality of certainty that suggested he already knew the answer and was merely awaiting confirmation. "He was..." Marsham consulted the records again. "Apparently the head footman. He was promoted to butler when the previous butler retired some 4 years ago." Lord Peter had set down the accounts ledger with the deliberation of a man placing a chess piece upon a board, and had requested that Mr. Pritchard be brought to the library immediately. The butler, who had appeared some 10 minutes later, was a man of perhaps 45, with the stiff bearing and carefully neutral expression that characterizes professional servants of the old school. He had seemed entirely unsurprised to be summoned, which was itself a curious detail, and when Lord Peter had gestured for him to be seated, Pritchard had complied with the automaticity of one accustomed to receiving orders. "Mr. Pritchard," Lord Peter had begun, his tone carrying that particular quality of gentle inevitability. "I wonder if you might tell me about your previous employment, specifically about the period approximately 15 years ago when you were apparently employed in a household in the Midlands, a household belonging to a gentleman named Hargreaves." The butler's face had undergone a remarkable transformation, the careful neutrality of his expression giving way to something raw and desperate. "I don't know what you're suggesting, sir," he had said, but his hands were trembling. "I have been in Mr. Reginald Ashford's employment for 7 years, and I have performed my duties with complete fidelity. I am not suggesting anything, Mr. Pritchard," Lord Peter had replied with terrible kindness. "I am merely observing facts. You were employed as a steward in the Ashford household 15 years ago. You were intimate with Mrs. Ashford. There are letters you see signed with the initial C, which is rather unusual for a steward's Christian name. Unless, of course, Charles is not your true name at all, but rather a pseudonym employed to protect your identity." The silence that had followed this revelation was sufficiently profound that one could have heard a pin drop upon the carpet with the force of an explosion. Pritchard's face had gone absolutely grey, and when he had attempted to rise, his legs had apparently refused to cooperate with the command his mind had attempted to transmit. "That woman," he had finally whispered, "drove her to death through his cruelty, and then he rehired me years later because he thought I had forgotten. He thought I was broken and grateful. But I have waited all these years for someone to discover the truth." The confession that followed emerged in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle gradually assembled by hands that trembled with the weight of years of accumulated guilt and anguish. Pritchard had remained seated, his body folded inward upon itself as though the act of speech were draining him of some essential substance, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man who had long since surrendered to the inexorable machinery of consequence. Inspector Marsham had positioned himself near the door with the wariness of one guarding against potential escape, though the butler seemed scarcely capable of movement, let alone flight. Lord Peter, having settled himself into one of the library chairs with the air of a man preparing for a lengthy discourse, had listened with the focused attention that characterized his approach to such matters, an attention unmarred by judgment, tempered by something that might almost have been compassion. "When Mr. Ashford dismissed me 15 years ago," Pritchard had begun, his voice barely above a whisper, "I believed it was because he had discovered my connection to Mrs. Ashford. The truth, I later learned, was far simpler and far more cruel. He had never cared about the affair at all. He had engineered it deliberately, orchestrated it with the precision of a man staging a theatrical performance. He had even," Pritchard's voice had broken slightly, "even hired me specifically because he knew I was vulnerable, that I had been recently widowed and was desperate for employment. He hired me knowing precisely what would transpire." Lord Peter had leaned forward fractionally. "Knowing that you would become intimate with his wife? Knowing that she would become attached to me, yes," Pritchard had confirmed. "He told me later, after he had dismissed me, that it was an experiment in human nature. He said he had wished to test whether his wife possessed any capacity for genuine affection or whether she was entirely devoid of feeling. He said that once he had proven her capable of infidelity, her life became merely a curious appendage to his own existence, no longer worthy of consideration." The butler had paused at this juncture, and in his eyes there had been a depth of pain that seemed almost too profound for the human frame to contain. "When she took the overdose of laudanum, I was living in London, working as a porter in a hotel. I did not learn of her death until weeks afterward, through a chance encounter with a former housemaid. And by then Mr. Ashford had already crafted the narrative that she had died of a weak heart, that her constitutional frailty had finally claimed her. "But you have maintained knowledge of these facts all these years," Lord Peter had observed. "How precisely did you come to be re-employed in this household?" "Pritchard." Bitter laugh had echoed through the library like the cry of a wounded animal. "Circumstance, Lord Peter, pure malevolent circumstance. I had fallen into penury, reduced to accepting whatever employment presented itself. 7 years ago, Mr. Ashford's previous butler retired, and I was desperate enough to apply for the position. I believe Mr. Ashford recognized me immediately, though he gave no sign of it. I think he found some grim amusement in the idea of employing me, of keeping me bound to him through employment and the necessity of maintaining silence regarding his previous cruelties. And when Timothy arrived at Thornfield with his knowledge of these events, Lord Peter had pressed gently, "What precisely transpired?" The butler had been quiet for an extended moment, his fingers working against the fabric of his trousers in a gesture of profound distress. Mr. Timothy came to the servants' hall on the evening of the 23rd. He was looking for Mr. Pritchard, for me. He said he had discovered letters, that he believed I could verify certain facts regarding his grandmother's death. He said he intended to expose the entire matter, that his father had hidden the truth for too long. Pritchard had paused, and his next words had emerged with the quality of a confession wrung from the depths of genuine remorse. I told him to meet me in the library after dinner, when the household would be quiet. I told him I would provide him with documentation, with proof of everything he suspected. But the truth is that I had spent 7 years in that house, watching Mr. Reginald Ashford move through his days with absolute impunity, watching him profit from his wife's death, watching him rebuild his reputation whilst I remained bound by my knowledge and my shame. Lord Peter's expression had remained perfectly neutral, though something in his eyes suggested he understood precisely what was coming. "You poisoned him," he had said, not as a question but as a statement of fact, not in a moment of passion but with premeditation. "You obtained the poison, strychnine perhaps, or arsenic. You placed it in the sherry decanter that stood in the library, knowing that Timothy would partake of it during your conversation." Pritchard had not denied it. Instead, he had simply nodded. And in that gesture there had been a finality that suggested some burden had finally, mercifully, been lifted. "I told myself I was protecting Mr. Reginald," the butler had said quietly, "that I was preventing the exposure of his crimes. But that was a lie I told myself to justify an act of pure revenge. Timothy Ashford was an innocent boy, caught in the machinery of his father's cruelty. And I destroyed him to punish a man I had hated for 15 years. Inspector Marsham had begun to move forward at this juncture, and Pritchard had made no resistance as the constable placed restraints upon his wrists. But before he was led away, he had turned to Lord Peter with a gaze of such profound desolation that it seemed to encompass all the tragedy and waste inherent in the human condition. "Did I do the right thing?" he had asked, and the question had hung in the library like an accusation against the very nature of justice itself. Lord Peter Wimsey did not answer the butler's question directly. Instead, he had watched in silence as Pritchard was led away by the constables, his body sagging beneath the weight of both physical restraint and the terrible knowledge that he had, through an act of vengeance, become precisely what he had despised, a destroyer of innocence, a perpetrator of violence against one who had been, despite his threatening intentions, ultimately a victim of circumstances largely beyond his control. When the library door had finally closed behind them, leaving only Lord Peter and Inspector Marsham in the gathering shadows of the room, Marsham had begun to scratch his ear with renewed vigor, as though the act might somehow organize the chaotic proliferation of facts and revelations into some coherent arrangement. "It's solved, then," Marsham had said finally, his tone suggesting something between relief and profound dissatisfaction. The butler murdered the young man in a fit of revenge, motive, opportunity, premeditation, all present and accounted for, a straightforward case of criminal justice. But Lord Peter had remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the desk where Timothy had died, and when he had finally spoken, his voice had carried none of the satisfaction one might expect from a man who had successfully concluded an investigation. Instead, he had sounded weary, as though he had been forced to contemplate depths of human misery that had exhausted his considerable reserves of philosophical detachment. "Straightforward," he had repeated softly. "My dear Inspector, I wonder if you truly believe that. We have discovered the identity of the murderer, yes, that much is beyond dispute. But we have not thereby solved the crime, for solving a crime implies understanding its causes, its moral architecture, the intricate web of human choices and human failures that led, with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy, to this moment." Marsham had looked genuinely confused by this pronouncement, but the evidence is conclusive. Pritchard poisoned Timothy. He has confessed. The case is closed. The case is closed, Lord Peter had conceded, in the manner that one might close a book whilst remaining profoundly ignorant of its contents. We know who administered the poison. We do not know, nor do I suspect we ever shall know with complete certainty, whether Pritchard truly intended to murder Timothy when he invited him to the library, or whether the act was committed in a moment of passion that overwhelmed his better judgment. We do not know whether Timothy's arrival at Thornfield, his discovery of the letters, his threat of exposure, ultimately precipitated the tragedy, or whether Pritchard had been contemplating this act for years, awaiting merely the opportunity to execute it. Lord Peter had risen from his chair and had moved toward the windows, gazing out into the gathering darkness of the October evening. Moreover, he had continued, we have not adequately addressed the question of who truly bears responsibility for this tragedy. Is it Pritchard who committed the act? Is it Reginald Ashford, whose cruelty and experimental approach to his wife's affections created the circumstances that led, indirectly, to her death and to Pritchard's decades of anguish? Is it society which permits men of property to treat those of lesser station as mere instruments for their psychological gratification? Or is it, perhaps, the very architecture of human emotion itself, our capacity for love, for betrayal, for revenge, for the preservation of resentment across years and decades? Marsham had attempted to articulate a response to this philosophical meditation, but had found himself lacking adequate words. Instead, he had shifted his weight from one foot to the other, in the manner of a man profoundly uncomfortable with the absence of clear moral categories. It was at this moment that a constable had appeared in the doorway with a telegram, which he had presented to Inspector Marsham with the air of one delivering information of considerable significance. Marsham had read it, his expression growing progressively more grave, and had then extended it to Lord Peter without speaking. The message was from Manchester, transmitted from Eleanor Hargreaves' husband, and it contained information that would fundamentally alter the investigation's trajectory. Eleanor had, apparently, attempted to take her own life in the hours following Lord Peter's departure from the house, a gesture interrupted only by her husband's unexpected return from his office. She had left behind a letter confessing that she had known Timothy intended to come to Thornfield, that she had deliberately withheld this information from her father, and that she held herself responsible for his death. Moreover, the letter contained a revelation of profound significance. Eleanor had known for years that her father had orchestrated the affair between her mother and Pritchard. She had discovered the evidence whilst sorting through her mother's belongings after her death. The knowledge had festered within her for 15 years, poisoning her OWN marriage and her sense of self. She had written that she had wanted Timothy to expose the truth, that she had hoped his intervention would force her father to acknowledge the crime he had committed against her mother. But in the aftermath of the murder, she had been seized by the terrible realization that her hope had led, indirectly, to the death of an innocent young man. Lord Peter had read the letter in absolute silence, his expression remaining perfectly composed, though something in the set of his jaw suggested he was experiencing emotions of considerable complexity. When he had finally looked up from the page, his eyes had possessed that peculiar quality of one who has witnessed the fundamental tragedy inherent in human nature and has determined that no amount of irony could adequately encompass it. "Inspector," he had said quietly, "I believe we must revise our understanding of this entire affair, for it appears that the crime we have solved is merely the outermost layer of a far more complex and deeply tragic structure, one that implicates not merely Pritchard, but every individual whose choices and concealments contributed to this catastrophe." The journey to Manchester in the dead of night possessed the quality of a pilgrimage undertaken by men who have begun to suspect that the destination, however urgently reached, will provide no genuine solution to the moral crisis they had collectively precipitated. Inspector Marsham had attempted on several occasions to articulate some form of professional reassurance, declarations that the investigation had been conducted with appropriate rigor, that no investigator could have anticipated Eleanor's attempted self-destruction, that the identification and apprehension of the murderer represented a successful conclusion to an admittedly complex case. But each such attempt had withered beneath Lord Peter's gaze. And Sham had gradually lapsed into a silence that suggested he himself had begun to question whether the mechanical processes of criminal justice bore any meaningful relationship to actual human morality. Eleanor Hargreaves lay in her bed at the Manchester infirmary, her wrists bandaged and her expression bearing that peculiar blankness of one who has temporarily surrendered to chemical sedation and the merciful suspension of conscious thought. Her husband sat vigil beside her with the devotion of a man who has suddenly perceived the profound fragility of those bonds that connect human beings to life itself. Lord Peter had been admitted to the room with some reluctance, the physicians expressing concern regarding the desirability of permitting the young woman to engage in conversation regarding the events that had precipitated her present crisis. But Eleanor had, upon awakening sufficiently to comprehend his presence, had gripped his hand with surprising strength and had insisted upon speaking. "You found the truth," she had whispered, and in her voice there had been neither gratification nor relief, but rather a kind of exhausted resignation. "You found who killed Timothy, and you have arrested him. But you have not solved anything at all, have you? You have merely confirmed what I have known for 15 years, that truth itself is a kind of poison that destroys everyone it touches." Lord Peter had seated himself beside the bed with the care of one approaching a sacred object, and when he had spoken, his voice had been stripped entirely of its characteristic irony, leaving only a kind of tender gravity. "Miss Eleanor, I must ask you a question that will perhaps cause you pain. When you discovered years ago the evidence of your father's orchestration of the affair between your mother and the steward, did you consider confronting him directly?" Eleanor's laugh, deep and bitter enough to curdle milk. "Confront him? I was 17 years old, Lord Peter. I was a girl who had just buried her mother, who had been told by every adult in my life that mother had died of a weak heart. I had no proof that my father had been anything other than a grieving widower. And even if I had possessed such proof, what would have been the result? I would have been dismissed as hysterical, as a girl inventing fantastic tales to protect her mother's memory." She had paused, her fingers working at the edge of the bandage wound about her wrist. "So instead, I said nothing. I carried the knowledge like a tumor, growing larger and more malignant with every passing year. When Timothy arrived with his discoveries, I truly believed, that his exposure of the truth would force father to acknowledge what he had done, that mother's death would finally be recognized as something other than a mere domestic tragedy. But what I truly desired, what I have desired for 15 years, was revenge, not through exposure, but through my father's complete and utter destruction." Lord Peter had been quiet for a long moment, and when he had finally spoken, his words had possessed the quality of a man articulating conclusions of profound personal significance. "You wished," he had said slowly, "for your father to experience the same anguish that your mother experienced, the same isolation, the same betrayal, the same sense that the very foundations of his existence had been constructed upon deliberate cruelty. You wished to recreate the trauma of your mother's death within his own consciousness, to make him understand, through direct experience, the magnitude of the harm he had inflicted." Eleanor had not denied it. Instead, she had simply closed her eyes, and a single tear had traced its way down her cheek with the inevitability of water finding the lowest point. "And now a young man is dead," she had whispered. "A young man who was, despite his threatening intentions, fundamentally innocent of any crime. He died because of my rage, because of Pritchard's rage, because all of us, myself, my father, Pritchard, my poor dead mother, have been consumed by this spiral of resentment and revenge." Lord Peter had risen from his chair at this juncture and had moved toward the window, gazing out upon the Manchester street where early morning light was beginning to filter through the industrial haze. When he had turned back to face Eleanor, his expression had been thoughtful, almost meditative. "There is a passage from Aeschylus," he had said, "in which the chorus observes that the bitter dregs of justice, once drunk, produce only further bitterness. I wonder whether your father ever truly understood the damage he inflicted upon your mother. I wonder whether Pritchard, in poisoning Timothy, accomplished anything beyond the perpetuation of the very cycle of violence and betrayal that destroyed your mother in the first place." He had paused, and in his voice there had been a note of profound weariness. "What I wonder most particularly, however, is whether the solution to human tragedy lies in the exposure of truth, or in some form of merciful forgetting. Whether confronting evil is truly superior to permitting it to die quietly beneath the weight of time and indifference." Eleanor had opened her eyes and had regarded him with an intensity that suggested she understood he was not truly addressing her at all, but rather wrestling with some fundamental question regarding the nature of justice itself. "What will happen to Pritchard?" she had asked. "He will face trial," Lord Peter had replied. "He will be convicted of murder, and he will be executed by the state. Justice, in its mechanical fashion, will have been served. Your father will likely see no legal consequences, though his reputation and his remaining years will be poisoned by the knowledge of what he has done. And you will remain in this bed, struggling to construct some meaning from the wreckage of this catastrophe." He had paused and added softly, "None of it will restore your mother to life, nor will it undo the harm that has been done. It will merely confirm what we have all learned through bitter experience, that truth, however necessary, does not in itself redeem the human condition." The trial of Charles Pritchard took place in the Winter Assizes of 1924, conducted with all the formal machinery that British jurisprudence could muster, and attended by a gallery of spectators whose fascination with the case appeared to derive less from any genuine interest in justice than from the opportunity to witness the public unraveling of a household they had long regarded with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Lord Peter Wimsey did not attend the proceedings, a circumstance that caused a certain amount of comment among those who had become accustomed to his involvement in such matters. Instead, he had retreated to his London residence with the air of a man who has completed a piece of work that has proven far more exhausting than the mere intellectual exertion of solving a puzzle typically permits. Bunter, observing his employer's uncharacteristic withdrawal from society, had taken the liberty of ensuring that the wine cellar was well stocked with particularly excellent vintages, and had arranged for the delivery of several first editions of classical texts that he suspected might prove more restorative than the social engagements that had been declined with increasing peremptoriness. The verdict, when it came, was never in doubt. The prosecution had presented an airtight case, backed by Pritchard's own confession and the forensic evidence of the poisoni. Enge, strychnine, in the sherry decanter, administered with a precision that suggested intimate familiarity with both the compound's properties and the mechanisms of its delivery. The defense had offered nothing more than a plea for mercy based upon Pritchard's psychological anguish and the mitigating circumstances of his association with the Ashford household, an argument that the judge had dismissed with the cold courtesy of a man who understands that sympathy for the criminal must always be subordinated to the abstract principle of justice. Pritchard had been sentenced to death, the sentence to be carried out in 6 weeks' time, and he had received this pronouncement with a composure that suggested relief rather than despair. It was precisely 3 days after the trial's conclusion that a letter arrived at Lord Peter's residence, delivered by hand and bearing the seal of the prison authorities. The envelope contained a single sheet of prison notepaper, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who has been reduced to the fundamental contemplation of his own mortality. Pritchard had written only a few lines, but they possessed a clarity and a philosophical resignation that suggested the approaching end of his existence had granted him a kind of terrible wisdom. "Lord Peter," the letter began, "I have been afforded the opportunity to read the trial transcripts, and I confess myself astonished by the manner in which the law has managed to transform my act of revenge into a tidy narrative of premeditated murder. And yet, in doing so, the law has provided me with a profound gift, for it has forced me to confront the distinction between the crime I intended and the crime I ultimately committed. I went to that library intending to kill a young man whom I believed posed a threat to the man I hated. But in doing so, I destroyed not merely Timothy Ashford, but Eleanor Haar. Greaves, that innocent girl who will carry the knowledge of my act for all her remaining days. I destroyed the fragile peace that Reginald Ashford had constructed, however fraudulently. And I destroyed myself, for I understand now that revenge does not heal the wounds inflicted by cruelty. It merely perpetuates them across new generations. I go to my death not because the law has convinced me of guilt. I am guilty, this much is beyond dispute, but because I have finally understood what your investigation was truly attempting to reveal, that truth without reconciliation is merely another form of violence, and that justice pursued without mercy is merely revenge dressed in judicial robes. Lord Peter had read this letter in absolute silence, and when he had finally set it aside, his expression had suggested that Pritchard's words had touched upon something he had long suspected, but had never quite been able to articulate. He had called Bunter into his study and had instructed his valet to prepare travelling arrangements for the following morning. They would journey, he had announced, to the village near Thornfield, not to the manor itself, but rather to the small cottage where Reginald Ashford had retreated following the trial's conclusion, a circumstance that suggested the old man had come to view his ancestral home as fundamentally poisoned by the events that had transpired within its walls. The journey was undertaken in a silence that suggested Lord Peter had finally begun to process the full moral implications of the investigation he had conducted. When they had arrived at the cottage, a modest structure of stone and thatch that seemed almost deliberately designed to express resignation and diminished circumstances, they had found Reginald Ashford sitting in a chair before the fire, staring into the flames with the fixedness of a man contemplating the architecture of Dam. He had not looked up when they were admitted, and it had been only when Lord Peter had seated himself in the opposite chair that Reginald had acknowledged their presence. "I have been expecting you," the old man had said quietly. "I have understood since the moment of Timothy's death that eventually someone would force me to confront what I have done. That someone would be you. It seems almost inevitable, given the structure of human justice." Lord Peter had not responded immediately. Instead, he had simply waited, understanding that silence often accomplished more than words could ever achieve. Finally, Reginald had spoken again, and his voice had carried the quality of a man recounting events that had happened to someone else entirely. I told myself, he had begun, that the experiment was merely intellectual curiosity, that I wished only to test the depths of my wife's character, to ascertain whether she possessed any capacity for genuine emotion or whether she was merely an automaton designed for the production of heirs. But the truth, which I have finally been forced to acknowledge, is far more contemptible. I was afraid, terrified, that she might actually love me, that she might possess some quality that would demand reciprocal affection. So I orchestrated her betrayal deliberately, to establish a fundamental barrier between us that would render intimacy impossible. He had paused, and when he had continued, his voice had been barely audible. And when she could no longer endure the knowledge of that betrayal, when she chose oblivion over the continuation of our marriage, I allowed everyone to believe she had simply been too delicate to survive in this world. I permitted her death to be reframed as a natural misfortune rather than acknowledged as the consequence of my deliberate cruelty. Lord Peter Wimsey sat in that cottage before the dying fire with a man who had, through 15 years of deliberate cruelty and calculated indifference, orchestrated a tragedy that had claimed not merely one life but several, though only one had ended in actual death. The old man's confession hung in the air like a miasma, poisoning the very atmosphere of the room, and yet Lord Peter's expression remained fundamentally unchanged, a circumstance that seemed to trouble Reginald more profoundly than any expression of moral outrage could have accomplished. When Lord Peter finally spoke, his voice carried that peculiar quality of gentle detachment that suggested he was commenting upon the weather rather than upon the systematic destruction of human souls. "Your confession," he observed, "is theoretically irrelevant to the legal proceedings that have already concluded. Pritchard will hang regardless of whether you acknowledge your culpability or spend the remainder of your days maintaining a facade of innocence. Eleanor will recover, or she will not, independent of your willingness to confront the consequences of your actions. And your wife remains equally dead. her suffering no more ameliorated by your belated acknowledgement than it was by your calculated indifference during her life. Reginald had flinched at this pronouncement, as though struck physically. "Then why have you come?" he had demanded. "If my confession accomplishes nothing, if it neither restores the dead nor prevents the living from suffering, why have you troubled yourself to seek it?" Lord Peter had risen from his chair and had moved toward the window, gazing out upon the darkening landscape with an expression of profound contemplation. "I have come," he had said finally, "not to secure your confession, for that would represent merely another form of vengeance, your public exposure and humiliation as recompense for the harm you have inflicted. Rather, I have come to understand something that has troubled me since the moment I first examined that small drawer in your morning room. I have come to comprehend the precise mechanism by which cruelty perpetuates itself across generations, creating cycles of violence and revenge that ultimately consume everyone they touch." He had turned to face Reginald directly, and in his eyes there had been a quality that suggested genuine, if deeply sorrowful, compassion. "You were not born a cruel man, Reginald. Somewhere in your distant past, someone taught you that love was dangerous, that intimacy was a weakness to be exploited rather than cherished. You passed that lesson to your wife through your betrayal. She passed it to Eleanor through her despair and her death. And Eleanor has passed it to herself through her attempted self-destruction. And Pritchard has passed it to Timothy through the act of murder, though the boy had committed no crime beyond the misfortune of being born into a family that had been fundamentally corrupted by your original sin." Reginald had begun to weep at this point, not with the theatrical intensity of theatrical remorse, but with the quiet, exhausted tears of a man who has finally comprehended the full magnitude of the devastation he has wrought. "What am I to do?" he had asked, his voice barely audible. "How am I to live with this knowledge?" Lord Peter had moved toward the door, pausing only to regard the old man with an expression of terrible finality. "That, I suspect, is a question you will spend the remainder of your life attempting to answer. You might attempt to use your remaining years to mitigate some portion of the harm you have caused, to provide support for Eleanor's recovery, to acknowledge publicly the truth regarding your wife's death, to establish some form of restitution for the injustices you have perpetrated. Or you might choose to retreat to your cottage and gradually fade into obscurity, allowing the machinery of time to accomplish what your conscience has failed to do. But I suspect that neither choice will grant you the forgiveness you are desperately seeking, for forgiveness must come from within, and I am not at all confident that you possess the capacity for genuine contrition." As Lord Peter and Bunter had made their way back to London, the valet had ventured to observe that the investigation appeared to have concluded, in a manner that satisfied neither legal justice nor moral resolution. Pritchard will hang for a crime that was, in its essence, merely the final manifestation of Reginald Ashford's original cruelty, Bunter had noted. Eleanor will likely recover physically, but her psychological wounds will remain for decades, and Reginald Ashford will face no legal consequences whatsoever, merely the private torment of his own conscience. Lord Peter had not disputed this assessment. Instead, he had gazed out the train window at the passing landscape and had spoken with a weariness that suggested the investigation had drained something fundamental from his reserves of emotional resilience. Justice, he had observed, is a human construct designed to impose order upon the fundamental chaos of human moral experience. We investigate crimes, identify perpetrators, and punish them according to the prescribed mechanisms of the law. But in doing so, we often ignore the deeper truths, that the murderer is frequently merely the visible manifestation of crimes far more profound and far less amenable to prosecution, that the real criminals, those who orchestrate cruelty through systems of social control and psychological manipulation, often escape entirely unscathed, and that the victims of such crimes multiply across generations, each one carrying forward the poison that was injected into their very souls by those who came before. He had paused and added with characteristic irony, "It is a deeply unsatisfying conclusion, I grant you, one that rather undermines the comforting narrative that justice properly pursued will restore order to a disordered world. But it is, I fear, considerably closer to the actual truth of human experience than the neat resolution one encounters in penny dreadfuls and the more optimistic varieties of detective fiction. Pritchard was executed on a grey December morning, maintaining to the end a composure that suggested he had made peace with his fate and had accepted that his death might, in some small measure, interrupt the cycle of cruelty that had consumed so many lives. Eleanor Hargreaves recovered sufficiently to return to her husband in Manchester, though those who observed her in subsequent years noted a certain brittleness to her manner, as though she had been fundamentally altered by her proximity to tragedy. And Reginald Ashford lived another 7 years, gradually fading into obscurity, dying ultimately in the modest cottage where Lord Peter had confronted him with the full weight of his own culpability. Lord Peter himself never returned to Thornfield, though on occasional evenings when the fog descended upon London in particularly impenetrable sheets, he would find himself reflecting upon that small drawer, upon the fragments of Eleanor's life that it had contained, and upon the terrible knowledge that some mysteries, once illuminated, cast shadows far darker and more extensive than the darkness that preceded their revelation.